Hi, this is Michael from Essential Music. At Essential Music, we know that there's so much good music between approximately 1963, 64 until the mid-90s that it's difficult to know where to start if you want to know all about the most influential and important musicians and bands at this time. So in each episode we have a detailed but concise biography of the band, so you know all about what was happening when they were making their landmark music. And we also have, of course, album reviews and some really helpful insights into understanding the genres, the movements of music, and the influential artists of this period. Today's episode, we're going to talk about one of the iconic bands of American music in the 1970s, and they are responsible for some of the best soulful boogie rock, as well as some country classics, and they even went so far as to have a #1 album and #1 hit in the smooth pop category. So a really versatile band. That band, of course, is the Doobie Brothers, and we're going to find out all about them right now. The Doobie Brothers came together in 1970, influenced by the burgeoning biker movement that was going on in Northern California around the San Jose and San Francisco areas, which is where this band hails from. And they were really there at the kind of end of the hippie movement and the beginning of the really the classic rock movement post 60s. So this versatile band got off to a really good start and became really influential. Their early to mid-period stuff is still played until today on classic rock stations in the USA, and their later period stuff is still played on smooth rock, like adult contemporary stuff. So a really versatile band. It all started off with the fortuitous meeting of a drummer and a guitarist, multi-instrumentalist, and singer in 1970. Let's find out about it. Since the mid-1960s, some of the most exciting music and cultural movements that had come out of the United States had come specifically out of Northern California or the San Francisco Bay Area. Some of the best bands like Jefferson Airplane, Santana, Quicksilver Messenger Service, Steve Miller Band, and the Grateful Dead, and others. And in 1970, John Hartman, the young drummer from Virginia, decided to go out there with the hopes expressly of meeting Skip Spence. Skip Spence had been the original drummer for Jefferson Airplane, but had soon left to form his own band as a guitarist and singer for Quicksilver Messenger Service and then the legendary and very influential Moby Grape. So when Hartman got out there, he found out, unfortunately, that the Grape would not be reforming. Californian Tom Johnston had grown up as a young man heavily influenced by R&B, soul, and blues, and had started off playing reed instruments, specifically the clarinet and the saxophone, before he picked up the guitar later on. But once he did, he became a very interesting guitar player with a very distinctive style and some known for his meaty riffs. He was a good songwriter too, a great soulful singer, and he ended up meeting Skip Spence of Moby Grape also, and this meeting would soon bear fruit. Unfortunately, as it turned out, Moby Grape would not be needing the services of John Hartman as a drummer because Moby Grape would definitively break up, and that was due to their leader Skip Spence's issues and problems with LSD use. However, Skip Spence did the favor of introducing Tom Johnston and John Hartman. The two became roommates. They hit it off, and they basically became the core and the founding members of the Doobie Brothers, and they would remain together as partners in that venture for years and years to come. From Washington State, Patrick Simmons, who was a singer, songwriter, guitarist, pianist, and flautist, while gigging around the San Francisco Bay Area, would eventually run into Tom Johnston and John Hartman, who were looking for another member to flesh out the band. And Pat Simmons' different, more countrified guitar style and a bit softer singing would be a really good counterpoint to Tom Johnston's more soulful voice and more meaty electric guitar playing style. So the two would be a really good combination of writing different types of songs, singing them differently, and with a different vibe that would really fit very well together. And he would write some of the Doobie Brothers' best loved hits. With the addition of bassist Dave Sjogren, the Doobie Brothers were now able to do some gigs as a functional band, and they would soon become the favorites of the Hells Angels motorcycle group that was around California, Northern California, San Jose, and they would become the house band at the Hells Angels clubhouse, Chateau Liberté in the Santa Cruz Mountains, for quite a while. Towards the end of 1970, while the Doobie Brothers were gigging at some club around San Jose, they had the good fortune to be discovered by a young up-and-coming A&R guy at Warner Brothers by the name of Ted Templeman. Ted Templeman would produce the Doobie Brothers' first album through their last album of their classic lineup, and this was his first album as a producer. Um, he would go on later to produce many important bands, Carly Simon, Montrose with Sammy Hagar, Van Halen later on, Van Morrison, and etc. But this was his first album as a producer, and as it was the Doobies' first album, also the mix was resulted in a little bit of an inexperience by both, perhaps. So there are two or three good songs on the album, but it's nothing special. They had not developed their full sound yet. And although he would go on to produce many classic albums by the Doobies, this one was a bit lackluster. Its only single, Nobody, didn't chart, 2 of 5 stars only. In late 1971, the Doobie Brothers had already released their first album, but it hadn't really done very well, and its only single, Nobody, hadn't charted, perhaps due to some inexperience. While their producer, Ted Templeman, would go on to produce many other great albums for the Doobie Brothers and others, he was still an inexperienced producer at this stage, and perhaps for that reason, the album suffered from a certain lack of production values, maybe. And apparently, the bassist Dave Sjogren took issue with the producer, and after disagreeing with several things while recording the next album, decided to leave the band. Interestingly, and perhaps to beef up their sound, their drummer decided he wanted to have a second drummer playing along with him so he could also do some percussion from time to time. So after adding the second drummer, Michael Hossack, in late 1971, the Doobie Brothers found themselves, of course, in need of a new bass player. And they would have great luck in finding an excellent bass player by the name of Chirin Porter, who, besides being a songwriter himself and would feature predominantly in backing vocals, from time to time would sing lead on stage, especially, and even on album. And he had a really great chordally rich bass sound, and it really added a lot of dimension to the kitchen, of the Doobie Brothers playing. And he would be a definite asset to the band from this moment until the end of their classic lineup. By this point, the Doobie Brothers had a pretty solid lineup that would continue for quite a while, but for some extra help, they called on legendary Little Feat Hammond B3 organist and barrel style blues pianist Bill Payne. And while Bill Payne would never officially be part of the Doobie Brothers, he would contribute a lot of great piano playing and Hammond B3 playing on their albums for the rest of the decade. And he's considered, rightfully so, by many pianists, including Elton John, as being one of the greatest living barrel house blues style pianists. And he added some really, really good honky tonk vibe to the Doobie Brothers albums. Their next album, Tulu Street, was a big success. It had a couple of classic singles from it, Jesus Is Just All Right and Listen to the Music, which continued to be played on classic rock radio until today, and are some of their really well-known songs from that album. And the second album was much, much stronger as a whole than their first album. Both the band had matured and had found the right players, and their producer Ted Templeman was already more seasoned. In any case, this would turn out to be a really good second album and a classic. Doobie Brothers sound. From this really strong second album, there were two strong singles. The first one, Listen to the Music, which reached number 11 on the Billboard charts, was an uncharacteristically mellow song sung by um, Tom Johnston, who was usually more into rockers, as we're going to see later on. And the second single, a fantastic song, Jesus is Just All Right, written and sung by Patrick Simmons, a rocker, but with kind of a cool gospel breakdown with some funky B3 organ playing by Bill Payne. And its B-side, Rockin' on the Highway, became a classic also. Released right in time for the 4th of July weekend, 1972, the Doobie Brothers' second album, Tulu Street, was a solid album from start to finish. The Doobie Brothers had really found their sound already with the right lineup and two drummers, which added a lot of dimension to their sound, a great bass player. Uh, Songwriting was strong, two great singles. So I'm going to talk about Cottonmouth, which was a kind of a country stomper, really cool. Jesus is Just All Right. Listen to the Music, Rockin' Down the Highway. Overall, a really solid album. Doobie's off to a great start, 4 out of 5 stars. Having a really successful second album and its enormously successful two singles, the Doobie Brothers, of course, had to tour that extensively on the road and didn't really have too much time for songwriting. But as soon as they got back into the studio, of course, their label put pressure on them to have a follow-up, strike while the iron was hot, so to speak. So the Doobies basically started putting together some snippets and some unfinished song bits and some riffs and some jams that they had never really developed into anything. And the result was quite satisfactory. Excellent, you might even say. Although their label was putting some pressure on the Doobie Brothers to come up with another hit album to follow the previous one, luckily they were in a very inspired frame of mind. And adding to that mix was the fortuitous inclusion of an old buddy of theirs, Jeff Skunk Baxter, who was a very well-known session player on the LA scene and had also been a founding member of Steely Dan, had already recorded 2 albums with the Dan, and he was a great guitarist, but especially was really valuable as a session slide guitarist and a pedal steel guitarist. And it was the pedal steel guitar that he was invited to play on a real gem from this album called South City Midnight Lady. And he was going to be very important to them later. As the story goes, one day when the Doobie Brothers were kind of warming up in the studio and just jamming a little bit, they fell back into one of their kind of wordless and nameless uh, jams that they had just been, playing around with for years and never really developed. Ted Templeman heard this and said, this should become a song. This is great. And they ended up turning it into Long Train Running, a very successful single at number 8. And later they would do another single based off of a riff that they had, been playing for a while, China Grove, which was a fantastic and one of the, song and one of their best loved rockers. And so these songs are still played on the radio until this day, especially China Grove, which has just a classic opening guitar riff. After the two preceding successful singles, the Doobie Brothers released what would be perhaps their greatest album, The Captain and Me, in March of 1973. Now, this is just, a fantastic album from start to finish. It's really hard to fault it for any way. But besides those two singles, some standout tracks would be Clear as the Driven Snow by Tom Johnson, which is a faceted song with different vibes throughout it. They keep changing and really, really cool. Completely different than any other song they did. And also, let's say South City Midnight Lady, which had that stellar steel guitar work by invited guitarist Jeff Skunk Baxter, and then a real swampy kind of a feel of a Tom Johnson song called Dark Eyed Cajun Woman. Excellent album from start to finish, one of my personal favorites, 4.5 out of 5 stars. The year was 1974, and Jeff Skunk Baxter, who had been a founding member of Steely Dan and had just completed his third album with them, Pretzel Logic, found himself in a bit of a quandary. The de facto leaders of Steely Dan, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen, had decided that they wanted to stop touring and to basically be reduced to a core duo of themselves that would, hire and fire session players as they saw fit. So Jeff now found himself without a band and with no touring schedule. So he went back to his old buddies in the Doobie Brothers, who welcomed him into the band officially. And his sound would begin to color the Doobie Brothers sound in a positive way for quite a while, almost since the beginning. More jazz pop sensibilities for sure. While the Doobie Brothers had gained a new permanent member in Jeff Skunk Baxter, they were about to lose one of their two drummers, in this case Michael Hossack, who was burned out from the relentless touring that they had done to support the previous two albums, especially. And he was replaced by an experienced drummer named Keith Knudsen, who was also very valuable as a backup singer and a harmony singer. And although he had been invited to sing harmony vocals on the album, it soon became apparent that his drumming skills would be needed, and he would be the second drummer until the end. In 1974, the Doobie Brothers released another great album, which was What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits. And they had two possible singles. The first one released, Another Park, Another Sunday, and the second one, Eyes of Silver. Both really good Tom Johnston songs, but they just didn't catch fire with the public for some reason. In some desperation, the record label decided to re-release their first failed single from their 1971 Doobie Brothers album, which was Nobody. It also really failed to chart. And things seemed lost when a Southern DJ in Virginia decided to flip over Another Park Another Sunday and play the B-side, which was Black Water, a real countrified ballad with a kind of a Southern feel by Patrick Simmons. It became the Doobies' first number one. The story behind Black Water goes back a few years previously to when Patrick Simmons, its composer, had been down in New Orleans to catch some shows with some Dixieland jazz and some blues, which he really, appreciated. And he was riding around the cable cars in New Orleans on Charles Street when the whole feeling of the city and the laid-back Big Easy vibe impelled him to write down the lyrics. And later, when he was picking in the studio some kind of country-ish style guitar stylings, Ted Templeman, the producer, convinced him to make it a full song, and it became a hit. In early 1974, the Doobie Brothers released their fourth album, What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits. And while not quite as good as the previous album, which was pretty much untouchable, The Captain and Me, it's a really strong album. A lot of great tunes on it. And especially what was originally side two of the vinyl is especially strong. So besides the singles Black Water, Another Park, Another Sunday, and Eyes of Silver, I'd also like to mention Daughters of the Sea, which is a really moody and interesting Patrick Simmons song written and sung by him. Also, a ballad written and sung by Patrick Simmons. Tell Me What You Want and I'll Give You What You Need is quite nice. And there was also the Tom Johnston rocker, You Just Can't Stop It. A really strong album, one of my favorites by them, and a fine follow-up to the classic album from before. Definitely a winner, 4.5 of 5 stars.
It's 1974, and the Doobie Brothers had already survived a couple of lineup changes, adding a new drummer and then losing that drummer, getting an additional guitarist, but they had already a number one hit with Black Water, and things seemed to be going really, really well. The band was tight, the band was versatile. They had 3 different guitarists with different styles, different writing styles also, different singing styles, 2 drummers with a trademark sound, a great bass player. They were rocking. And then came trouble. Tom Johnston, their principal singer, songwriter, and perhaps most recognizable voice and guitar style in the band, was having problems.
The Doobie Brothers spent 1974 touring heavily behind their third successful album in a row, just as they had done the previous 2 successful albums. And the rigors of the road, and especially Tom Johnston's long time stomach problems began to cause him some serious issues with his health, and he would end up spending most of 1975 out of commission in the hospital recovering. And this definitely took a toll on the band because Tom Johnston, of course, was one of the founding members, uh, one of the principal singers and songwriters, lead guitarists, and kind of the leader of the band. And his presence was definitely needed, and his absence was sorely felt during this time. The first half of 1975 was spent in the studio recording the Doobie Brothers' fifth album, Stampede, and they definitely felt Tom Johnston's absence because he was ill in the hospital. And to make up for that a bit, they invited more friend musicians to help out, including Ry Cooder on slide guitar for a couple of tracks, Maria Muldaur back in vocals for one of uh, the more prog rock type tracks that they did, which was very interesting, and Bill Payne from Little Feat on piano. But definitely Tom Johnston was missed on this album. The two singles from the Doobie Brothers' 1975 album, Stampede, were Take Me in Your Arms, Rock Me, a soulful remake of a Motown classic song. That reached number 11, and there was also the pretty interesting rocker Sweet Maxine. It only reached number 40 on the charts, but a good song. These were two fine singles, but in my opinion, they didn't quite really capture the full spirit of the album itself, which, like the name Stampede, was a kind of a Western themed album. And quite an interesting experiment for the Doobie Brothers, this album. Released in the spring of 1975, the Doobie Brothers' fifth album, Stampede, had been recorded under duress due to the absence of leader Tom Johnston due to his hospitalization. And he missed quite a bit of the production of that album, although he did contribute some great songs. And one of them was Texas Lullaby, a really nice country themed song that suited the Western theme of the album. There were also, of course, Take Me in Your Arms and Sweet Maxine, the two singles. And a very interesting song by Patrick Simmons was called I Cheat the Hangman. Now, this was actually kind of a prog rock song in many ways, quite different from anything that they did before or since. Very ethereal, eerie about a Confederate ghost haunting his previous residence, backing vocals by Maria Muldaur. Tom Johnston's crunch of guitar was missed, though, in this album, 4 of 5 stars. By the spring of 1975, it was more than clear that Tom Johnston was simply not going to be able to participate in the tour of the Stampede album. He had already taken some time off from 1974 through early 1975 for his health problems with his stomach that he had been troubling him for some time. But once he tried to do some shows, he ended up collapsing on stage and had to be hospitalized due to a bleeding ulcer. So now with their principal songwriter, lead guitarist, singer, songwriter, and leader of the band basically out of commission for who knows how long, the band was really distraught and the morale was extremely low, and they thought about calling it quits. That's when Jeff Skunk Baxter remembered that he had done some singing and some guitar playing in Steely Dan with a young up-and-coming keyboardist and singer named Michael McDonald, who had participated on the Katy Lied album with Steely Dan for backing vocals and some keyboards. Not everybody was sure this was going to work, but Pat Simmons lobbied for him, and they decided to give him a try. As he would recall years later, when Michael McDonald got the call from his buddy Jeff Skunk Baxter to fill in for Tom Johnston, McDonald fully expected that it would be a temporary gig just to finish the tour commitments that they had through 1975, because he was a keyboardist, not a lead guitarist like Tom Johnston was. He had a completely different type voice, albeit a really soulful voice, an amazingly soulful voice. And his principal instrument was the keyboard once again, which would change the sound of the band completely in a different direction. So he came in with the idea that probably he would just be there for the rest of the year, and then once Tom was better, he would be gone. As it turns out, things would be quite different. Michael McDonald and Tom Johnston both had soulful voices. They were completely different voices in that Tom Johnston had more of a gritty Motown type delivery, and Michael McDonald was more of the smooth Philly sound, which went really well with his keyboard playing, his Hammond 3 and his keyboards. This really changed the Doobie Brothers sound in a more polished direction. So the grit that Tom Johnston had brought to the Doobie Brothers was notably missing now, and combined with the fact that the other two guitarists, Patrick Simmons was more of a country picker, and Jeff Skunk Baxter was more of a jazz pop guitarist. So that grit was really gone from the Doobie Brothers. So the single, Take It Into the Streets, written and sung by Michael McDonald, did quite well. It reached number 13 in the USA, while a single, Wheels of Fortune, by Patrick Simmons, sounding kind of gritty, didn't do very well, only number 87. Although the Doobie Brothers label had resisted any lineup changes that included Michael McDonald on the roster, producer Ted Templeman championed his different style of playing and singing, and was pretty aware that this would take the Doobie Brothers in a completely different direction, more polished, especially with his Hammond B3 playing and smoother style singing. And the Doobie Brothers were convinced, due to the success of the two singles that Michael McDonald had sung, the second one of those being It Keeps You Running, which went to number 37 on the charts. So that gritty previous Doobie Brothers sound seemed to be a little bit out of fashion, and the smoother sound was fully embraced by the Doobie Brothers. The new album, Taken Into the Streets, which featured the new Michael McDonald, more polished sound, was released in the spring of 1976. For me, this is a little bit of a jarring experience to hear the new style Doobie Brothers featuring the Michael McDonald polished Philly soul sound together with the grittier and more countrified version of the Doobie Brothers, which we had known before. And I will say that though this album was very successful, its singles Take It Into the Streets, Wheels of Fortune, and It Keeps You Running, especially the Michael McDonald's written and sung singles, were very successful. Take It Into the Streets was an album which for me is not quite so satisfying as especially the three previous ones, in particular the 1974 and 1973 albums. Another great song on here was For Someone Special, written by bassist Tyrone Porter for his friend Tom Johnston. 4 stars.
The Doobie Brothers could survive a lot, but the loss of Tom Johnston really shook the band to its core. Their trademark sound of biker boogie was replaced by smooth pop R&B ballads and singing style of Michael McDonald. And although this brought them theoretically their greatest success with their top album in 1978, it also caused a lot of problems within the band, as we're going to see right now.
After sitting out 1976 and the Taking It to the Streets album, Tom Johnston in 1977 felt somewhat better and returned to the fold. However, things had changed in his absence. His gritty, soulful style, which had previously served the Doobie Brothers so well, was now at odds with 2 other styles that were also different from each other, and that was Michael McDonald's Hammond B3 playing and his soulful, silky smooth style of vocals, and Jeff Skunk Baxter's jazz pop guitar explorations, which he had fully explored in Steely Dan, and was really leaning towards that kind of sound, the Steely Dan jazz pop style, while Michael McDonald was into the other aspect of Steely Dan style, which was more the funky pop stuff. Neither one of those meshed very well with the gritty, soulful style of Tom Johnston, so this became a bit of an issue in 1977. Tom Johnston tried to fit in to the band that he had founded years before with drummer John Hartman, but things just weren't the same. They had changed drastically since in the 1 year that he had been gone, and he found that his brand of biker boogie just didn't mesh with the sound anymore. And although he went so far as to write, and the band even recorded 5 songs, they he just really felt at odds, and he felt like a stranger in his own band. And basically, he had his 5 songs removed. His picture was even featured on the back cover of the next album in 1977. But in fact, he was gone, and uh, you could say the Doobie Brothers had been taken over by new management, as it were. His sound would be sorely missed by the fans for some time. Indeed, with Tom Johnston gone, Michael McDonald and Jeff Skunk Baxter were free to give full rein to their jazz pop leanings and their smooth ballads, and that's exactly what they did. The next album, 1977's um, Living on the Fault Line, was released basically with no successful singles. It was sold pretty well and was pretty well regarded by some Doobie Brothers fans, but in fact the sound was completely different. It sounded nothing like what the band had sounded before, and it was really a kind of a jazz pop album. The single Little Darlin' and Echoes of Love didn't really chart very well, and in fact, the album tracks were better than the singles. So, speaking of the album, Living on the Fault Line was released in the summer of 1977, and as I said before, the 2 singles didn't chart very well, and they are the songs which least impressed me on this album. So, the top 4 tracks I'll choose would be the title track, Living on the Fault Line, which is pretty jazzy. Need a Lady, which is a pretty funky track written by and sung by the bassist, Turan Porter. Um, Chinatown, which is an interesting jazz pop experiment, and You Belong to Me is pretty good. It was co-written with Carly Simon, who would have her own and superior hit version of that song a year later. This one is a little bit too dark and more about obsession, and Carly Simon's version is funky and more about ownership. 3.5 out of 5 stars. The Doobie Brothers spent most of 1978 recording what would be their minute by minute album, but the band was very dispirited because creative tensions within the band were extremely high, especially between Michael McDonald and his one time friend Skunk Baxter. Uh, Although Skunk had been the one to suggest bringing Michael McDonald into the fold, their creative differences began to really come to a head as far as musical direction in the band. And the fact that their last really jazz pop experiments didn't do very well in the previous album, they basically considered breaking up. The members kind of went their own separate ways after they half-heartedly released the album to the market in late 1978. Imagine their surprise when DJs started playing the single from the album, which was "What a Fool Believes," and it became a huge smash, nominated for Grammys. The lead single was so successful, in fact, that it became their second #1 hit, uh, duplicating the success of 1974's Black Water, written by Patrick Simmons. And the follow-up single, Minute by Minute, also a huge hit, reached #14 on the charts. And a total of 3 hit singles from the album and talk of Grammy nominations. And this kind of angered other members in the band because this was definitely Michael McDonald's trademark sound on these successful singles, and the other Doobie Brothers, especially Jeff Skunk Baxter, felt slighted by this. And this feeling was also shared by founding drummer John Hartman. All of this angst among the other members of the Doobie Brothers didn't stop the fact that minute by minute, the album and the 3 singles were a huge hit. They basically swept the 22nd Grammy Awards. and basically dominated the charts for about 5 consecutive weeks of 1979. And since they were all Michael McDonald songs with his kind of trademark sound, and this was a sound which became extremely influential among other pop artists in 1979, and you begin to hear people kind of ripping off the so-called Michael McDonald sound, especially Robbie Dupree's Steal Away. Furthermore, it certainly didn't help the fact that this was the second time that Michael McDonald had brought in another writer to help him write a hit song. The first time had been Carly Simon the year before with You Belong to Me, and this time their huge first single, What a Fool Believes, was co-penned between Michael McDonald and Kenny Loggins. So the other members felt like this was really becoming Michael McDonald's show, and his so-called trademark Michael McDonald sound was now dominating the Doobie Brothers. And founding member drummer John Hartman realized this was a far cry from the good time biker boogie he had envisioned in 1971 with Tom Johnston. And on the other hand, Jeff Skunk Baxter was frustrated because his hopes of doing a kind of a Steely Dan Part 2 with avant-garde jazz pop was certainly frustrated. So, disillusioned, the two members left the Doobie Brothers in early 1979 and went their separate ways, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the Grammy success. Although you can see, even on the album cover, the perplexed expressions on Jeff Skunk Baxter and John Hartman's faces. To be fair, it wasn't completely a Michael McDonald album. His sound did dominate, but the other successful single besides his was "Depending on You," which was a quite nice song by Pat Simmons. And another song which was not a hit but was a good rocker, also by Pat Simmons, was "Don't Stop to Watch the Wheels," which really kind of sounded like he was channeling or missing the sound of Tom Johnston, an uncharacteristically uh, hard rocker by Pat Simmons, who usually was known for his softer side. So the top five tracks for me on this album are What a Fool Believes by Michael McDonald, Minute by Minute by Michael McDonald, Here to Love You by Michael McDonald, a nice funky sound. And although it wasn't a hit single, it's my favorite of those three Michael McDonald songs. Plus a great Patrick Simmons song, Depending on You. And finally, Don't Stop to Watch the Wheels. So I give this album a good solid 4.5 of 5 stars. Sure, the Doobie Brothers had their most successful hit album of their career with 1978 and 79's Minute by Minute, but that basically destroyed the band because the founding member drummer John Hartman had to be replaced with another drummer to augment the remaining drummer Keith Knudsen. Their slide guitarist Jeff Skunk Baxter was gone, and they had to get another guitarist to replace him. Also, they added some saxophone player, percussionist, backup singer. In short, it became Michael McDonald's show completely, with the only original member remaining at this point was Patrick Simmons, bolstered, of course, by longtime bassist Chirin Porter, who was still in the band, but it was definitely not a democracy anymore. It was Michael McDonald's show all the way. Ironically, although Michael McDonald had free reign to do what he wanted in the remade Doobie Brothers, he was apparently also losing interest in the band, anxious to leave it, and in fact, more interested in helping other people do their band projects. For example, Kenny Loggins, Christopher Cross, Lauren Wood, and Nicolette Larson, not to mention Steely Dan, all received help from Michael McDonald in the same year between 1979 and 1980. So in 1980, the Doobie Brothers were making what would be their last album before breaking up and reforming differently years later. The album in 1980, One Step Closer, was a weak album, and obviously nobody really wanted to be there, and people were saving their best material for future solo albums. As Michael McDonald would comment years later, perhaps somewhat regretfully, the band that he now had at the end sounded nothing like the band that he had joined in 1975. And after even longtime member Pat Simmons had stopped showing up for rehearsals, the band, after releasing the album in 1980, finally decided to call it quits. And Patrick Simmons could only be convinced to do a farewell tour once he was promised by the other members that this really would be the end. So they got together the members, including some original members, original drummers John Hartman and Michael Hosick were brought on for some special participations on some songs during the tour, as was Tom Johnston. So they finished it up, I guess, triumphantly with all the original members at some point joining in. And by 1982, it was over. It took the Doobie Brothers nearly a full year to make their last album, One Step Closer, and it really was a weak album. Apparently, everybody was just saving their best songs, presumably for their future solo albums, knowing that the end was near. However, it had a really great single, Real Love, which is actually one of my favorite Michael McDonald songs from this period. Number 5 single, and an instrumental, kind of jazzy South bass strut. But overall, really a weak album. 2.5 of 5 stars.
The Doobie Brothers could survive a lot, but the loss of Tom Johnston at the end of 1974 and then really officially in 1977, this change in style really confused not only the Doobie Brothers themselves, but the fans of the Doobie Brothers, because what had started off as good time biker boogie rock in the early 70s, and then country ballads with some of Patrick Simmons' sensitive stuff, and even some little kind of prog rock stuff when Jeff Skunk Baxter came into the fold, was changed one more time with Michael McDonald's smooth balladry. This really confused the Doobie Brothers' longtime fans. They didn't know who were the Doobie Brothers anymore, and perhaps that's explained by the fact that not even the Doobie Brothers knew who the Doobie Brothers were anymore. With such disparate styles trying to survive inside the same band, it was only a matter of time before it imploded, but not without leaving some fantastic music that's still played until today. Thanks for joining us. Click on the link right here, and there's a great playlist of the music that we talked about here for you to listen to and enjoy. And remember, always support your band with the official site, buy official merchandise, download official music. See you next time at Essential Music, where you get the best biographies and album reviews with insightful commentary about the bands that you love. See you next time. Bye.